Hi, everybody. This week we're going to be getting into what I consider is probably one of the more important informational lectures for this whole course here in week 4. This week we're going to be talking about film speeds. We're going to be talking about f-stops. We're going to be talking about shutter speeds. And then we're going to be talking about how they all relate with one another and how they all tie in together, and then how they should look and how they will look in your photography. So let's begin by just taking a look at some information that I've prepared for you to see here and follow along. Okay, what we are seeing here are the typical film speeds, and I want to point out that before I begin with that you will see this on your camera as ISO, which stands for the International Standards Organization. And some typical film speeds that you'll likely see on your camera, and it may not be all of these that I'm showing you here, but typically you will see a film speed of 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and 3200. And notice, if you will, that each one doubles the next. So from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 400 to 800, and so on. So keep in mind that they double each other, and we're going to come back and talk about that in just a moment here and how that all ties together. Something to know then is that the lower the ISO setting, the less sensitive the CMOS chip is to light. However, the quality of the photo is better. So don't forget that when we're talking about the lower ISO settings, we are talking about actually better resolution or better, sharper photographs. When I'm talking about the CMOS chip, this would be in terms of digital photography today, because that is the computer chip in the camera, just much like film would be in a traditional film camera. So we are exposing light on the CMOS chip, and just keep in mind that the lower the ISO setting, the better your photography will look in terms of sharpness and resolution. And likewise then, the higher the ISO setting, the more sensitive the CMOS chip is to light. However, the picture quality isn't quite as good. The photo can look grainy or noisy, again, talking in terms of digital photography. So really, what we want to do then when we go out and photograph is that we want to use the lowest ISO setting for the total amount of light that's available. So if you have bright light, you can get away with shooting at a lower ISO setting, such as 100. If you're photographing indoors with available light without using flash, then you're going to probably need to raise that ISO setting to something like maybe 400 or 800 so that the CMOS chip is more sensitive to the lower levels of light so that you can get a decent exposure under this type of lighting condition. Slower ISO settings are used when taking photographs under brighter light conditions or when using flash, and it is best when your subject isn't moving. Now we will tie this all together with subjects that are moving and not moving, and so in this case a slower ISO setting is not going to allow you to really use the very fast shutter speeds that your camera is capable of. You'll see that later as we get into exposure. The faster ISO settings, such as 800, 1600, and so forth, are used when taking photographs under dimmer light conditions and or when you have moving subjects or you are doing action photography. So for an example, if you go into a gymnasium where the light isn't as bright as it might be on a sunny day outside, there you will want to boost your ISO to something like maybe 400 or 800, which will allow you now to use the faster shutter speeds so that you can stop the action, if that's what you care to do, in something like a basketball game that you might be photographing in a gym. Let's take a look at the typical shutter speeds. Every camera has shutter speeds. You may not see them exactly on your camera as you do here, but these are typical ones that you would see. And keep in mind, when I talk about shutter speeds, and when you see them here as whole numbers, they're actually a fraction of a second. So in other words, I could come in here and put a numerator of 1 above each of these shutter speeds. So we're talking about 1 second, a full second right here, and some cameras will go beyond a full second and allow you to do lengthy shutter speeds for doing time-lapse photography. But for the sake of our demonstration here, let's talk about 1 second, a half a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/8, 1/15, 1/30, 1/60, 1/125th, 1/250th, 1/500th, and 1/1000th of a second. Okay, and keep in mind that at this end, we are really talking about the faster shutter speeds right here, and then down here in this end, we are actually now talking about the slower shutter speeds. And this becomes very handy later on where we will talk about how to be creative with your photography. Okay, now usually the shutter is located inside the camera. On some types of cameras, they could be located in the lens, but that's not very likely. Shutters are usually located in the camera. Again, the shutter speed numbers are a fraction of a second. And something important here, the higher the denominator, the faster the shutter speed, like I just pointed out. Okay, so we're talking about this being the denominator of, let's say, a fraction. So the higher this number, then the more or the faster the shutter is. And just the opposite would be true of going in the opposite direction here, going this way. So keep that in mind. Each successive shutter speed setting doubles the speed of its preceding setting. So for an example, when I'm talking about a 60th of a second, and I go to 1/125th of a second, now we have doubled the speed of the shutter. When we double the speed of the shutter, then the amount of time that that shutter is open is actually cut in half. So if we're going to faster shutter speeds, then the amount of time the shutter is open cuts down or becomes much, much faster. So for an example, 1/125th, and then if I go to a 2/50th, I have now doubled the speed of the shutter, and so that the light coming through now will only remain on the CMOS chip half as long. This will become more familiar to you as the more you do photography, so don't let this confuse you too much. And keep in mind with these videos, you can always go back, of course, and watch them over and over again. Let's talk about what the shutter speed controls. The shutter controls the amount of time that light exposes the CMOS chip. And it also controls sharpness of motion. All right, now when we're talking about the amount of time, we're talking about the amount of time that the shutter remains open so that an exposure can be made. When we're talking about sharpness of motion, we're talking about if we're going to blur a moving subject or even blur a static subject if we're not able to hold the camera steady enough with a slow shutter speed. So keep that in mind as well. Let's take a look at, we're going to look at some photographs here that will show some of these examples here in a moment. But let's look at things like faster shutter speeds are usually about a 2/50th of a second or faster, such as a 2/50th, a 500th, or a 1,000th of a second. And those are considered the faster shutter speeds. And the slower shutter speeds are usually a 60th of a second or slower. And this could be used to blur moving subjects for creative effects. And like I said a moment ago, I will be showing you some examples of that here in just a few minutes. Let's take a look here at some faster shutter speed examples. You can see the little boy playing in the water here, and he's jumping off the side into the water. And you can see it. This is called stop action photography. Both of these photographs that you're seeing here were photographed with fast shutter speeds. The duck that you're seeing on the right-hand side is we've caught the duck in motion, complete stop action photography as the duck is flying. Here's another example of a surfer, and this is great because you can actually see the little droplets of water. And if you were not using a fast shutter speed, this has taken at probably something like between a 500th or even a 1,000th of a second. That will stop the motion, the fast motion that you're seeing that is happening in this photograph, and can really capture some neat details of the water. Here's a boy playing tennis. You can see the ball in the upper left-hand corner, and you can see that his eyes are intent on hitting that ball. And again, stop action. Everything is sharp within the photograph of the moving subject, in this case being the boy that is about to hit this tennis ball. So these are some great examples of what a fast shutter speed can do. Let's take a look at some slow shutter speeds now. Here is a dog that is out playing in the yard, and this was taken purposely for this reason, where we've taken the shutter speed and have set the shutter down to like a 30th of a second, or maybe even a 15th of a second, and let the dog go through the photograph with a slower shutter speed. And the neat thing about this photo is that it shows that there's actually motion taking place in a whole different way than it does if it would have been stop action. Stop action works fine as well, but in this case, it's just a little bit more creative way of showing motion in a photograph. These are popular photographs where we have running water, and many times as a new photographer, you may not think of doing water with slow shutter speeds. And keep in mind, when using slow shutter speeds, you want to use a tripod to keep the camera steady, and then things like the rocks that you see in the foreground will remain sharp because the camera is steadied on a tripod. However, if you look at the water, notice how it has this sort of cotton look to it. It's the motion of the water is being recorded with a slow shutter speed and gives this cloud effect, and makes this type of photograph, I think, look much nicer than if it were done with a fast shutter speed, where we're capturing the individual, let's say, water droplets, much like the surfer photograph that we saw moments ago. Now here's a method of actually, again, putting your camera on a tripod, having a stationary subject, such as the back of the lady that you see here, as a subway train goes by that goes very fast. Okay, so in other words, the way this picture was photographed was that we have a camera on the tripod with a slow shutter speed, roughly a 15th of a second, and the person is standing perfectly still so that there is no motion showing there, but with a subway train going by that is actually moving very quickly, it gives the effect that you're seeing here. Again, a much more creative way to show that there is movement in a photograph. This is called using a slow shutter speed and panning with the moving subject. This would be using your still camera or your digital camera, much like you would a movie camera or a camcorder type of camera. So you're putting your shutter on a very slow shutter speed. This is taken at about a half of a second. And as long as the motion of your camera is keeping with the motion of the motorcycle racer in this case, then what you're doing, you're following the action. So the slow shutter speed and the motorcycle keep up with each other, making that the sharp part of the photograph, or at least we can say the sharper part of the photograph, while the stationary background becomes blurred. This is also a great way to hide distractions that may be in the background so that you can draw emphasis to your subject. This takes a lot of practice, but don't be afraid to do that. That's the neat thing about digital photography. Now you're not having to use film and a lot of expense and so forth. You can try things, delete things, and just keep practicing this over and over again. So again, this is panning with the motorcyclist with a slow shutter speed at about 1/2 of a second, blurring the background. But as you're following the motion of the motorcyclist, that makes that part fairly sharp in focus.